Settle into the sleepy mind channel, and tonight we journey into salt. Long before it reaches a kitchen, a shoreline, or the surface of a road, this simple mineral has already moved through oceans, lifted into the air as fine grains, and settled into the pores of rock and soil. It is easy to overlook because it is small and familiar, yet it quietly shapes how water moves across the earth and through living bodies, linking coastlines, air, and living systems through a continuous exchange that rarely draws attention to itself. Long before it reaches a kitchen, a shoreline, or the surface of a road, this simple mineral has already moved through oceans, passed through the air as fine grains, and settled into the pores of rock and soil. It is easy to overlook because it is small and familiar, yet it shapes how water moves across the earth and through living bodies. Picture a shallow basin at the edge of a bright, wind-washed coast. A thin sheet of seawater moves across pale ground, warming under open sky. As the water thins, the surface begins to dull and then brighten again as crystals quietly take form. Each grain marks the end of a long journey through ocean currents and evaporation. A journey that continues again when the next tide arrives. Over the course of this story, the same mineral will reappear in places that seem far removed from open water. It will pass through soil and into the roots of plants, travel through the fluids of the human body, and gather along the routes where people once moved food and materials across landscapes. These connections will emerge gradually as the same physical rules repeat at different scales. For now, the focus rests on how a small crystal moves. Water carries it, air lifts traces of it, and living tissue draws it inward and releases it again. By following these movements, the shape of entire environments begins to come into view, from coastlines and river mouths to the spaces between cells where fluids quietly shift in response to dissolved minerals. Later, this same mineral will quietly shape how signals move along nerves and how muscle fibers contract and release. Those effects are not dramatic in isolation, but together they help set the pace at which bodies respond to their surroundings, linking a grain dissolved in water to movements that unfold across entire tissues. Long before refrigeration or sealed containers, salt helped people keep food from spoiling, making it possible to store fish or meat for months at a time. This simple practice changed how far people could travel and how long they could stay in one place. Even now, many foods still rely on salt, not just for taste, but for how it changes texture and behavior during preparation. For something so common, salt carries a quiet sense of importance. It appears in trade records, in old place names, and in the layout of roads that once existed, mainly to move it from one region to another. Its presence links coastlines to inland plains, kitchens to mines, and everyday meals to slow geological processes that unfolded over immense stretches of time. In moments when we spend some time with salt, the focus will move closer to its physical nature, how it forms, how it behaves in water and in living bodies, and how it interacts with the environments it passes through. For now, it is enough to notice how often this small, pale crystal appears in the world around us, shifting quietly between land, water, and human hands. Salt appears simple at first, as small pale grains that scatter easily across a surface, yet each grain has a precise physical structure. At its most basic, Salt is a mineral composed mainly of sodium and chloride bound together. These two elements join in a repeating pattern, forming tiny solid units that stack in a regular way. When a pile of salt is poured onto a table, the grains settle into small heaps because each crystal is already solid and complete, carrying its structure within it. At times, when individual salt crystals are examined more closely, their shape becomes easier to recognize. Many form with flat faces that meet at right angles, creating small cubes that catch light along sharp edges. This shape is not random or decorative. It reflects the way sodium and chloride arrange themselves at the smallest scale, locking into a repeating grid that extends in all directions as the crystal grows. As more units attach to the surface of a forming crystal, the flat faces remain aligned, and the overall shape keeps its squared outline. The way dissolved salt draws water across membranes is like a sponge placed against damp fabric, pulling moisture toward itself without needing to be pressed. This internal arrangement controls how salt behaves when it comes into contact with moisture. When a crystal touches water, the outermost layer begins to loosen as water molecules slip between the sodium and chloride ions. The edges and corners soften first, and the sharp lines that defined the cube begin to blur. As more of the crystal meets water, the regular grid that once held everything in place breaks apart into individual ions that drift into solution, leaving no solid structure behind. At ground level, the surface appears pale and granular, with fine crystals catching light where shallow water recently thinned under open air. The same physical rules shaping open water appear again at a smaller scale within living tissue, where dissolved salt guides how fluid moves between cells and the spaces around them. From this setting, the same pattern continues along a different path. The size of a salt crystal changes how quickly this process unfolds. Smaller crystals present more surface area to moisture in proportion to their volume, which means water can reach more of the crystal at once. As a result, fine grains of salt dissolve quickly when placed on a damp surface or on the tongue. Larger crystals expose less surface area at the start, so the water has fewer entry points, and the solid structure holds together for longer before it disperses. This difference in crystal size also changes how salt is experienced in the mouth. A fine grain spreads across the tongue almost immediately, producing a steady, even sense of saltiness as it dissolves into saliva. A larger flake or coarse crystal rests on the surface for a moment before breaking apart, creating a brief, more concentrated sensation where the crystal makes contact. The physical form of the crystal shapes the timing and intensity of how saltiness is perceived, even though the underlying substance is the same. The way salt crystals behave in moisture can be thought of in the same way that a compact block of ice behaves compared to crushed ice. A large piece of ice melts slowly because only the outer surface is in contact with warmer air or water, while crushed ice melts quickly because many small surfaces are exposed at once. In a similar way, fine salt crystals dissolve rapidly because water can reach many edges at the same time, while larger crystals release their structure more gradually as water works inward from the outside. In moments when salt dissolves, the ordered solid structure that once held the crystal together disappears. The sodium and chloride separate and spread through the surrounding liquid, moving freely instead of remaining locked into a fixed pattern. This shift from solid crystal to dissolved particles changes how salt interacts with other materials. In dry form, the crystal has weight and shape and can be held between fingers. In solution, it becomes part of the liquid itself, no longer visible as a distinct object, yet still present in every part of the mixture. At times, when salt is dry, the flat faces of its crystals can reflect light in small flashes as the grains tumble or settle. The sharp edges catch illumination, creating a subtle sparkle across a surface. As soon as moisture enters, that reflective quality fades, replaced by a smooth, wet sheen where the solid form is being erased. The transition from crystal to solution happens quietly and quickly, yet it involves the complete dismantling of a rigid structure that formed through slow accumulation. The formation of salt crystals begins when dissolved sodium and chloride come together in a setting where water is being removed. As liquid recedes, the ions draw closer and begin to align into the repeating grid that defines the solid mineral. The first tiny clusters provide a framework for additional units to attach, and over time the crystal grows outward, maintaining its squared faces as long as conditions remain stable. Variations in temperature, movement of liquid, or the presence of other minerals can influence how smoothly the faces develop, leaving some crystals more regular and others slightly uneven. In moments when evaporation concentrates mineral at the surface, it resembles thin frost forming on a window pane as warm air meets cold glass, leaving a delicate crust behind. Once formed, a salt crystal carries within it a record of how it grew. The edges and faces reveal the direction in which the structure expanded, and the overall size reflects how long the crystal remained in conditions that allowed growth to continue. When crystals break apart, the fragments retain the same internal pattern as the original, each piece still arranged according to the same grid. This is why even a crushed grain of salt keeps the same basic cubic structure at smaller scales. In moments when salt crystals move through different environments, their physical form changes in response to contact with air and moisture. In dry conditions, the edges remain crisp and the grains stay separate. In humid air, a thin film of water can collect on the surface, softening the crystal and causing neighboring grains to cling together. Over time, this can lead to small clusters where individual crystals are no longer easily distinguished, their surfaces partially dissolved and reformed as they touch. The behavior of salt at this small scale influences how it spreads across surfaces. Fine salt dusts evenly, filling small gaps and coating a broad area with a thin layer of crystals. Coarser grains fall more sparsely, leaving patches of surface exposed between them. When moisture is present, the fine grains vanish first, while the larger ones linger, holding their shape a little longer before yielding to the same process of dissolution. This difference in persistence creates changing patterns as the solid phase gives way to solution. Along the edge of a river mouth, darker fresh water glides over denser layers beneath, the surface gently rippled by passing wind. This movement does not end at the shoreline. As water carries dissolved minerals inland, the same processes continue through soil and into the routes people use to move food and materials across land. In moments when these grains continue to meet moisture, the boundary between solid and liquid shifts back and forth depending on the surrounding conditions. A crystal can dissolve into water, disappear from view, and later reform when the water evaporates, returning to a solid with the same underlying structure. The cycle of dissolution and recrystallization allows the mineral to move through environments without losing its essential arrangement, shifting quietly between visible form and invisible presence as water comes and goes. This shift in setting does not change the underlying movement of water and dissolved mineral. Salt appears in the landscape in ways that look very different from the neat grains kept in a container, yet the same mineral structure lies behind each form. In some coastal regions, shallow pools of seawater stretch across flat ground, held in place by low walls of earth or stone. As the sun warms the surface of these pools, water slowly lifts into the air, leaving the dissolved salt behind. The liquid level drops by small increments, exposing thin films along the edges of the pools where the first crystals begin to appear. In moments when evaporation continues, the concentration of salt in the remaining water increases. At first, the solution stays clear, but when enough water has left, the dissolved mineral can no longer remain evenly distributed. Tiny crystals begin to form along the bottom and sides of the pool, clinging to rough patches on the surface. These first clusters provide points for more material to attach, and the crystals spread outward in flat sheets that mirror the shape of the shallow basin beneath them. Over time, the surface becomes coated with a pale layer that thickens as more water leaves and more salt settles into place. In areas where the process is repeated again and again, thin layers accumulate on top of earlier deposits. Each cycle of filling and drying leaves behind another sheet of crystals, building a stacked record of repeated evaporation. The texture of these layers can vary depending on how quickly the water disappears and how still the surface remains. Calm conditions allow crystals to grow in relatively even sheets, while wind or movement in the water can break forming crystals apart, creating more irregular patterns that spread across the ground. At times, when salt guides slow circulation in dense water, it behaves like a gentle slope, guiding a heavy cart, shaping direction without any single push. Away from modern coastlines, salt can also be found locked within solid rock. These deposits began as shallow seas that once covered parts of the land, spreading water across wide, low-lying basins. As climate and geography shifted over long periods, some of these seas became cut off from open circulation. Water continued to evaporate from their surfaces, concentrating dissolved minerals until layers of salt formed on the basin floor. When the water finally vanished, thick beds of salt remained behind, later buried by sediments carried in by wind or water. In moments when layers of sediment built up on top of these salt beds, pressure increased. The weight of overlying material pressed down on the crystalline layers, compacting them and sealing them within the rock. Over immense spans of time, these deposits became part of the geological structure of the region. In some places, later movements in the Earth's crust folded or lifted these layers closer to the surface, while in others they remained deeply buried, preserved beneath hundreds of meters of stone. The age of many rock salt deposits reflects how long these processes have been at work. Some formed hundreds of millions of years ago, when the outlines of continents were different and shallow seas covered areas that are now dry land. The salt within these layers carries the chemical signature of ancient oceans, recording the composition of seawater at the time the crystals first formed. Once sealed away beneath sediment, the deposits remained largely unchanged, protected from weathering by the surrounding rock. At times, when rock salt is exposed or accessed through mining, Its appearance differs from the loose crystals seen in evaporation pools. The mineral forms dense, solid masses that can be cut into blocks or carved out in large chambers. The surfaces of these exposed faces often show faint lines or bands that mark the boundaries between different layers of deposition. Each band reflects a period when salt was laid down, separated by intervals, when other materials settled on top before the next cycle of evaporation added another layer. The contrast between sea salt and rock salt lies not in what the salt is made of, but in the path it took to become solid. In shallow coastal pans, the transformation from dissolved mineral to crystal can happen over days or weeks, guided by sun and wind. In ancient basins, the same transformation unfolded slowly, with repeated cycles building thick deposits that were later hidden beneath layers of sediment. In both settings, water acts as the medium that carries salt in and out of solution, controlling when crystals form and when they dissolve again. Inside a warm kitchen space, steam lifts from a pot, while moisture beads along cooler surfaces nearby. What unfolds across landscapes is echoed again inside the body, where the balance between dissolved salt and water quietly shapes circulation and the exchange of fluid through fine networks of vessels. The gradual loss of water from these environments shapes the landscape in visible ways. As shallow pools dry, the ground beneath becomes coated in pale crusts that crack and shift as they thicken. In desert regions where ancient salt beds reach the surface, broad flats can stretch for kilometers, reflecting light in a uniform glare that marks where old seas once stood. The presence of salt in these places offers a physical trace of environments that no longer exist, preserved in mineral form long after the water has gone. The way salt gathers in these settings is similar to the way residue appears when a pot of water is left to simmer until it runs dry. As steam lifts away, a thin film forms along the bottom of the pot, made of the substances that were once dissolved in the liquid. In the landscape, the same principle applies on a larger scale. Water leaves, and what it carried remains behind, spreading across the surface in quiet layers that thicken with each cycle of drying. Seen from another scale, the same exchange unfolds with quieter force. The filtering of dissolved salt through layered ground is like water passing through stacked cloth, slowing and separating as it moves from layer to layer. With gradual change, these deposits can be reshaped by wind, water, and movement of the ground beneath them. Loose crusts can be broken apart and carried away, while buried layers remain fixed within the rock. The mineral continues to move between solution and solid wherever water is present, repeating the same simple transition that first allowed it to gather in shallow pools and ancient seas. Salt is not only found as solid crystals on land, but also remains constantly present in the water of the ocean, carried invisibly through every wave and current. When seawater is held in a container, it looks clear and ordinary, yet within it, countless sodium and chloride particles move freely, spread evenly through the liquid. This dissolved form allows salt to travel wherever the water itself flows, linking distant parts of the ocean through the slow movement of the same material. The amount of salt held in seawater is not the same everywhere. In some regions, the surface water contains a higher concentration of dissolved mineral, while in others, it is more diluted. Warm, dry areas tend to lose water to the air more quickly, leaving the remaining liquid with a higher salt content. As water molecules lift from the surface and drift away, the salt stays behind, becoming more concentrated in the shrinking volume of liquid. In contrast, areas that receive heavy rainfall or steady input from rivers tend to have lower salt concentrations near the surface. Fresh water entering the sea spreads outward before fully mixing, creating layers where the water is lighter and less salty than the denser water beneath. These layers can sit on top of one another for some time, forming subtle boundaries that shift as wind and movement disturb the surface. The meeting of fresh and salty water creates gradients where the composition changes gradually rather than abruptly. In moments when salt concentration changes, so does the density of seawater. Water with more dissolved salt is slightly heavier than water with less. This difference may be small, but across large areas, it influences how water settles and moves. Denser water tends to sink beneath lighter layers, while fresher water remains closer to the surface until mixing evens out the difference. This vertical sorting creates slow, continuous movement as layers adjust their position relative to one another. The movement of salt within the ocean is closely tied to the movement of the water itself. When currents carry warm surface water across long distances, the dissolved salt travels with it, shifting the distribution of salinity across entire basins. In regions where water cools and becomes denser, the salt-laden liquid can sink and flow along deeper pathways, carrying its mineral content into darker, colder layers far below the surface. The mineral does not move on its own, but follows the same routes carved by the motion of the water around it. Where evaporation is intense, such as in enclosed or semi-enclosed seas, surface salinity can rise noticeably. As water lifts away, the remaining liquid grows denser and can begin to sink, drawing in surrounding water to replace it. This exchange sets up local circulation patterns that move salty water downward and pull fresher water across the surface. The repeated lifting and sinking creates a slow turnover that redistributes salt within the basin. Across a dry inland flat, faint crusts crack underfoot, revealing softer layers that shift when weight settles. From ground level to the spaces between cells, the pattern repeats as water carries dissolved mineral through boundaries that redirect flow without stopping it. In moments when ions move through narrow channels in tissue, the flow mirrors grains sliding through a narrow funnel, steady rather than sudden. Rainfall and river input work in the opposite direction, spreading lighter, fresher water across the top of saltier layers. This fresh layer can drift across the surface for considerable distances before mixing fully, especially in calm conditions. The contrast between the lighter surface layer and the heavier water below creates a gentle separation that persists until wind, waves, or temperature changes disturb the balance. Over time, the boundary softens as the two layers blend. The changing patterns of salt concentration shape how water moves at much larger scales. Differences in density contribute to the formation of broad currents that carry water across oceans, guiding the slow exchange between surface and depth. These currents act like long pathways along which water, heat, and dissolved minerals travel together, connecting distant regions through a continuous flow that takes years to complete a full circuit. The setting changes, but the physical rules remain in place. Here, the presence of salt also influences how water behaves when temperatures change. As surface water cools, especially in colder regions, it becomes denser and begins to sink. If that water holds a higher concentration of salt, the increase in density is even greater, encouraging downward movement into deeper layers. This sinking motion pulls surface water from surrounding areas, drawing in new water that carries its own dissolved salt, continuing the cycle of movement and exchange. The shifting balance between evaporation, rainfall, and circulation creates a constantly changing pattern of salinity across the ocean's surface. No region remains fixed in its composition for long. Seasonal changes alter how much water is lost to the air or added by rivers, and currents continually carry water from one area to another. The dissolved salt moves with these flows, redistributing itself in response to changes in temperature, wind, and the shape of coastlines. The way salt spreads through seawater can be compared to the way a spoonful of sugar disperses when stirred into a cup of tea. At first, the crystals settle in one place, but as the liquid moves, the dissolved substance is carried outward, gradually reaching every part of the cup. In the ocean, the stirring is provided by wind, tides, and the slow turning of currents. The salt that enters one region becomes part of a much larger system of movement, spreading through the water as the sea itself circulates. In moments when these processes continue, the ocean maintains a dynamic balance between areas of higher and lower salt concentration. The mineral remains dissolved, moving quietly within the shifting layers of water, shaping how the ocean's mass arranges itself from surface to depth. The patterns formed by this movement remain in motion, changing with the rhythm of evaporation, rainfall, and the slow circulation that carries salt through the body of the sea. Salt does more than remain dissolved in seawater. By changing the density of water, it becomes part of the slow movement that carries heat from one region of the planet to another. In warmer areas, surface water absorbs energy from the sun, becoming lighter as it warms. At the same time, evaporation lifts water molecules into the air, leaving behind a slightly higher concentration of dissolved salt. The combination of warmth and increased salinity shapes how this surface water behaves as it travels across the ocean. In moments when warm, salty surface water moves away from the equator toward cooler regions, it begins to lose heat to the surrounding air. Cooling causes the water to become denser, and the dissolved salt further increases that density. As the water grows heavier, it starts to sink beneath the surface, sliding down into deeper layers of the ocean. This downward movement carries stored heat away from the surface, transporting energy into colder depths where it spreads gradually through surrounding water. The way dissolved salt draws water across membranes is like a sponge placed against damp fabric, pulling moisture toward itself without needing to be pressed. Within the narrow spaces between cells, fluid gathers along thin boundaries that guide movement without stopping it. The sinking of dense, salty water draws surface water from neighboring regions to replace it. This replacement water, warmed by the sun in lower latitudes, flows along the surface toward cooler areas, continuing the transfer of heat. The pattern repeats as the newly arrived water cools and sinks. In this way, a slow, continuous exchange forms between warm surface waters and colder, deep layers, moving heat across vast distances without any visible boundary. The process does not happen in a straight line. The shape of coastlines, the presence of continents, and the contours of the ocean floor guide the pathways along which water can move. As currents bend around land masses and follow the slopes of underwater ridges. The transport of heat follows these winding routes. The dissolved salt remains part of the moving water, maintaining the density differences that allow the circulation to continue. In regions near the poles, surface water can become both cold and salty. Cooling removes heat, and the formation of ice leaves salt behind in the remaining liquid, increasing its density further. The dense water sinks more readily, slipping beneath lighter layers and spreading into deep basins. As it travels along the ocean floor, it carries cold, salt-rich water away from the poles, allowing slightly warmer surface water to move in and take its place. This exchange helps regulate how quickly polar regions lose heat and how warmth from lower latitudes is distributed. As deep water moves slowly through the ocean, it retains some of the thermal energy it carried from the surface. The gradual release of this heat into surrounding layers influences the temperature of large volumes of water over long periods. This slow spreading of warmth and cold contributes to the overall balance of temperatures across different parts of the ocean, shaping conditions that affect weather patterns along nearby coasts. The link between salt, density, and heat transport can be pictured in the same way that warm and cold air move within a room. When a heater warms the air near the floor, the lighter warm air rises, while cooler, denser air sinks. This circulation sets up a gentle movement that redistributes heat through the space. In the ocean, the movement is slower and driven by differences in temperature and salt content rather than by air pressure, but the principle of denser fluid sinking and lighter fluid rising remains the same. This movement carries forward into the next environment without pause. As surface currents carry warm water into cooler regions, they moderate temperatures along coastlines. Areas that receive a steady flow of warmer water experience milder conditions than they would if the surrounding ocean remained cold. The dissolved salt within these currents does not supply the heat itself, but by helping determine which water sinks and which remains at the surface, it shapes the pathways through which heat can move. The physical properties of salt-laden water guide the circulation that carries warmth from one part of the world to another. Changes in the balance between fresh and salty water can alter how efficiently this heat transport operates. When large amounts of fresh water enter the ocean from melting ice or heavy rainfall, surface layers can become lighter and less likely to sink, even when cooled. This can slow the downward movement that drives deeper circulation, affecting how heat is carried into the depths. The resulting shift in flow patterns changes where warm and cold water travel, reshaping temperature distributions over wide regions. Over long periods, the combined movement of salt and heat through the ocean creates a slow, planet-wide exchange that links distant environments. Warmth absorbed in one region can be carried far from its source before being released, while cold, dense water formed near the poles spreads through deep channels beneath warmer layers. The mineral content of seawater remains woven into this movement, quietly shaping the density changes that make the circulation possible. As evaporation concentrates mineral at the surface, it resembles thin frost forming on a window pane, as warm air meets cold glass, leaving a delicate crust behind. Salt changes how water behaves when temperatures drop toward freezing, altering the way ice forms and breaks apart at the surface. When pure water cools, its molecules arrange themselves into an ordered structure as they solidify, locking into place to form ice. The presence of dissolved salt interferes with this process. As water molecules begin to settle into the regular pattern of ice, the sodium and chloride ions disrupt the alignment, making it harder for the solid structure to take shape in the same way. At certain points, when salt is scattered across a layer of ice, the first change happens at the boundary, where solid and liquid meet. A thin film of water often exists on the surface of ice, even in cold conditions. As salt comes into contact with this film, it dissolves into the moisture, lowering the temperature at which the water can remain liquid. The thin layer that was already present becomes more fluid, and small channels of liquid form along cracks and irregularities in the ice surface. These pockets of liquid allow more salt to dissolve, spreading the effect outward. At ground level, the surface appears pale and granular, with fine crystals catching light where shallow water recently thinned under open air. As the salty solution seeps into tiny gaps in the ice, it weakens the rigid structure that holds the ice together. The edges of ice crystals soften and begin to break apart as the liquid disrupts the bonds between water molecules. Over time, sections of the ice loosen and separate, turning a once solid surface into a mixture of slush and water. The transformation does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually as salt continues to dissolve and spread, extending the area where ice can no longer maintain its solid form. The temperature of the surrounding environment influences how far this process can go. In moderately cold conditions, the addition of salt can keep water in a liquid state well below the usual freezing point. The more salt that dissolves, the lower the temperature at which the mixture can remain fluid. In very cold conditions, however, the surrounding cold can overwhelm the effect, and the salty solution itself can begin to freeze, forming a different kind of solid mixture that contains both ice and concentrated brine. At certain points, when salt is used on roads and walkways, the same physical interactions take place on a larger scale. The grains scatter across the surface and settle into small depressions and cracks. As vehicles pass, or as wind moves across the ground, some of the crystals are pressed into the ice, increasing contact with the thin liquid layer at the surface. The salt dissolves, spreading into the ice and creating patches where the solid structure weakens and breaks apart. This creates uneven, wet surfaces that provide more friction than smooth, continuous ice. The dissolved salt does not remain confined to the ice surface. As the ice melts and the liquid drains away, the salty water can flow into nearby soil or across pavement. In areas where this runoff collects, the concentration of dissolved salt can rise, changing the properties of the water that moves through the environment. The same ions that disrupted ice formation continue to influence how water interacts with surrounding materials once the ice has broken down. Here, the presence of salt in melting ice also changes how quickly the process unfolds. As ice breaks apart and water forms, the liquid can absorb heat from the surrounding air and surfaces more efficiently than solid ice. This absorbed heat further promotes melting, allowing the boundary between ice and liquid to shift. The salt remains part of the solution, continuing to interfere with the reformation of ice crystals, as long as the mixture stays below the temperature at which pure water would normally freeze. This interaction between salt and ice can be compared to the way sugar changes the texture of ice cream. When sugar is mixed into a freezing mixture, It lowers the temperature at which the liquid solidifies, preventing the formation of large, rigid ice crystals. The result is a softer texture that remains scoopable at temperatures where plain water would be fully frozen. In a similar way, salt disrupts the orderly freezing of water, keeping parts of the surface in a softer, more fluid state. From this setting, the same pattern continues along a different path. At certain points, when salt guides slow circulation in dense water, it behaves like a gentle slope, guiding a heavy cart, shaping direction without any single push. As the ice continues to melt and refreeze under changing conditions, salt remains embedded in the cycle. When temperatures rise, more ice breaks down into liquid, carrying salt into solution. When temperatures fall again, some of this liquid may freeze, trapping concentrated salt in small pockets within the ice. These pockets can create weak points that break open as conditions shift, allowing more liquid to spread through the solid structure. The repeated movement between solid and liquid leaves the ice surface uneven and fragmented over time. Beyond the immediate surface, the dissolved salt that washes away from melting ice can accumulate in nearby soil and water. The mineral changes how water moves through these materials, affecting how moisture is absorbed and retained. As salty runoff seeps into the ground, it alters the balance between solid particles and liquid films in the soil, changing how easily water can flow through small spaces. The influence of salt extends outward, from the point where ice first meets the grains scattered across its surface, continuing to shape the behavior of water as temperatures fluctuate. Salt does not remain confined to coastlines, roads, or icy surfaces. Once it enters the soil, it begins to change how water moves through the ground and how solid particles interact with the moisture that fills the small spaces between them. Soil is made up of grains of sand, silt, and clay, with thin films of water coating their surfaces and occupying the tiny gaps between them. When dissolved salt enters this network of spaces, it becomes part of the liquid that threads its way through the ground. As salty water moves through soil, the dissolved ions interact with the surfaces of soil particles. Fine clay particles carry electrical charges along their surfaces, and the presence of sodium and chloride in the surrounding water changes how these particles attract or repel one another. In some cases, sodium can cause clay particles to separate slightly, loosening the structure of the soil. This change in structure affects how easily water can pass through, sometimes slowing drainage and causing water to pool closer to the surface. Along the edge of a river mouth, darker fresh water glides over denser layers beneath, the surface gently rippled by passing wind. In dry regions where irrigation is used to support crops, water drawn from rivers or underground sources often carries small amounts of dissolved salt. When this water spreads across fields and then evaporates under strong sunlight, the water leaves while the salt remains behind. With each cycle of irrigation and evaporation, a thin residue is added to the soil surface. Over time, these small additions accumulate, raising the salt concentration in the upper layers of the ground. As salt builds up in the soil, the balance of water between plant roots and the surrounding ground begins to shift. The presence of dissolved salt in the soil water makes it more difficult for roots to draw moisture inward. Water tends to move from areas of lower salt concentration to areas of higher concentration, and when the soil solution becomes salty, the gradient that normally draws water into plant tissues is reduced. Roots remain in contact with damp soil, yet the movement of water into the plant slows, leaving tissues under strain even when moisture appears to be present. The physical presence of salt in the soil also affects how water spreads and drains. In soils with higher salt levels, the thin films of water that coat particles can become more tightly bound, changing how easily water moves from one pore space to another. In some cases, this can lead to the formation of crusts at the surface, where evaporating water leaves behind a hardened layer of salt and compacted particles. This crust can limit how quickly rainwater soaks into the ground, causing more runoff and less infiltration during brief storms. Once salt accumulates in the soil, it can be difficult to remove. Rainfall or added fresh water can dissolve and carry some of the salt deeper into the ground. But in regions with limited rainfall, the downward movement of water may not be enough to flush the salt away. Instead, dissolved salt can remain within the root zone, cycling between deeper layers and the surface as water moves up and down through the soil profile, with changes in moisture and temperature. Each time water rises toward the surface and evaporates, more salt is left behind in the upper layers. The filtering of dissolved salt through layered ground is like water passing through stacked cloth, slowing and separating as it moves from layer to layer. Over longer periods, the gradual increase in soil salinity can alter the physical and chemical environment of the ground to such an extent that it no longer supports the same types of vegetation. Fine root hairs encounter a surrounding solution that draws water away from them rather than supplying it, and the structure of the soil itself may become less stable as the balance between particles shifts. The ground can harden in some places and become slick or poorly drained in others, creating uneven conditions across the landscape. The slow accumulation of salt in agricultural soils has played a role in shaping the rise and decline of past farming regions. In areas where irrigation water was repeatedly applied without sufficient drainage to carry salts away, the surface layers of soil became increasingly saline over generations. Fields that once supported crops gradually lost productivity as the physical environment around the roots changed. The land itself remained in place, but the invisible movement and concentration of dissolved minerals altered its capacity to sustain growth. This shift in setting does not change the underlying movement of water and dissolved mineral. The way salt spreads through soil can be compared to the way residue builds up in a sponge that is repeatedly soaked in slightly salty water and then allowed to dry. At first, the sponge appears unchanged, but with each cycle of soaking and drying, more residue is left behind in the pores. Over time, the texture of the sponge changes, and the movement of water through it becomes less smooth. In the ground, the same slow accumulation alters the tiny pathways through which water moves, reshaping the physical environment beneath the surface. As water continues to pass through soil, carrying dissolved salt with it, the mineral remains part of the shifting balance between solid particles and liquid films. The changes occur gradually, often unnoticed from one season to the next, yet over long spans of time, they leave lasting marks on the landscape, shaping how water moves, how roots interact with their surroundings, and how the ground responds to the repeated arrival and departure of moisture. Salt plays a quiet but constant role inside the human body, moving through fluids and tissues as part of the ordinary movement of water in and out of cells. When salt dissolves in the fluids that circulate through the body, the sodium and chloride separate and drift among other dissolved particles, spreading through blood, the fluid between cells, and the thin layers of moisture that coat internal surfaces. These dissolved particles contribute to the overall balance of substances that determine how water is distributed across different compartments within the body. Nerve cells rely on carefully controlled differences in sodium concentration across their outer membranes. At rest, sodium is kept in higher concentration outside the nerve cell than inside. When a signal is triggered, small channels open in the membrane, allowing sodium to move inward along this gradient. The inward movement changes the electrical balance across the membrane, creating a brief pulse that travels along the length of the nerve. Once the signal passes, other mechanisms restore the original balance by moving sodium back out, preparing the cell for the next impulse. Inside a warm kitchen space, steam lifts from a pot while moisture beads along cooler surfaces nearby. Muscle fibers use a similar movement of sodium to initiate contraction. When a muscle fiber receives a signal, channels in the cell membrane open and sodium flows inward. This change in electrical balance triggers a cascade of physical events inside the fiber, leading to the sliding of internal structures that shorten the muscle. The process depends on the controlled movement of sodium across membranes, and when the balance of sodium in surrounding fluids shifts too far in either direction, the timing and strength of contraction can be affected. The body does not store large reserves of sodium in solid form. Instead, sodium remains dissolved in fluids and is continually lost through sweat, urine, and other secretions. As water moves through the body, it carries dissolved salt with it, and the balance must be replenished through regular intake. This constant movement means that the level of sodium in the body reflects recent conditions rather than long-term storage, changing in response to how much is consumed and how much is lost over time. As ions move through narrow channels in tissue, the flow mirrors grains sliding through a narrow funnel, steady rather than sudden. Chloride, the partner ion to sodium in salt, moves alongside it through the same fluid spaces. Together, these ions help maintain the balance of electrical charges in body fluids. The presence of these dissolved particles influences how water distributes itself between the space inside cells and the space outside them. When the concentration of dissolved salt in the fluid around cells rises, water tends to move outward, and when it falls, water tends to move inward. The continual adjustment of these concentrations keeps the volume of cells within a narrow range. The kidneys play a central role in managing this balance. As blood passes through these organs, water and dissolved substances are filtered into small tubules, where selective reabsorption takes place. Sodium and chloride are drawn back into the bloodstream in controlled amounts, while excess is allowed to pass out of the body with urine. The fine control of this process depends on a network of channels and transporters along the tubules that move ions in and out of the forming urine, adjusting the final concentration that leaves the body. When intake and loss remain in balance, the concentration of dissolved salt in body fluids stays within a narrow range. When the balance shifts, the physical environment around cells changes. If sodium levels fall too low, the movement of water into cells can increase, altering their volume and affecting how membranes and internal structures function. If sodium levels rise too high, water can move out of cells, changing the spacing between tissues and the pressure within fluid compartments. These shifts occur at the scale of individual cells, yet their effects can be felt across entire systems as the body responds to altered conditions. The way sodium and chloride move through the body's fluids can be compared to the way dissolved minerals circulate through a network of small channels in a porous stone. Water seeps through the tiny spaces, carrying ions with it, and selective barriers along the pathways allow some particles to pass while holding others back. Over time, the distribution of dissolved substances reflects both the routes the water takes and the filters it passes through. In the body, blood vessels, cell membranes, and kidney tubules form a similar network of pathways and checkpoints that guide the movement of salt through different compartments. As fluids circulate and exchange between blood, tissues, and the spaces between cells, salt remains in constant motion, never settling into a fixed position. The mineral does not appear as a solid crystal within the body, but as dissolved particles that influence the movement of water and the transmission of signals along nerves and muscles. This continuous circulation links the physical structure of cells to the broader flow of fluids through the body, maintaining the conditions that allow electrical and mechanical activity to proceed smoothly. Seen from another scale, the same exchange unfolds with quieter force. Salt continues to move through the body as part of the fluid that bathes muscles and circulates through the heart and blood vessels. As blood flows through branching networks of arteries that narrow into fine capillaries, dissolved sodium and chloride travel with the moving liquid, spreading into the thin layers of fluid that surround individual muscle fibers. This surrounding fluid forms a narrow boundary between the blood in vessels and the cells that carry out physical work, and its composition shapes how signals and water pass into and out of the tissue. When a muscle fiber is at rest, the fluid around it contains a stable concentration of dissolved salt. The outer membrane of the fiber maintains a difference in sodium concentration between the inside of the cell and the surrounding fluid. This difference is held in place by specialized transport proteins that move sodium out of the cell after each electrical event. The membrane itself acts as a thin barrier that separates two slightly different chemical environments, and the balance across this boundary sets the stage for movement. As a signal arrives along a nerve, it reaches the surface of the muscle fiber and triggers small channels embedded in the membrane to open. Sodium flows inward from the surrounding fluid, moving down its concentration gradient. This inward movement alters the electrical state of the membrane, and the change spreads along the surface of the fiber as a wave. Inside the cell, this electrical shift leads to the release of stored calcium from internal compartments, which in turn allows the internal contractile structures of the muscle to slide past one another. The fiber shortens slightly as thousands of microscopic interactions take place in parallel, converting chemical and electrical changes at the surface into mechanical movement within the tissue. Across a dry inland flat, faint crusts crack underfoot, revealing softer layers that shift when weight settles. The way dissolved salt draws water across membranes is like a sponge placed against damp fabric, pulling moisture toward itself without needing to be pressed. After the contraction, sodium must be moved back out of the muscle fiber to restore the resting balance across the membrane. This outward transport requires energy and proceeds continuously as blood flow brings fresh fluid past the tissue. The surrounding fluid acts as a reservoir, receiving the sodium that leaves the cell and carrying it away through the network of vessels. With each cycle of contraction and recovery, small amounts of sodium move in and out of muscle fibers, yet the overall concentration in the surrounding fluid remains stable because of the steady circulation that refreshes the environment around the cells. The heart relies on a similar pattern of sodium movement, but on a tightly coordinated schedule that allows its chambers to contract in sequence. As waves of electrical change pass through the specialized muscle fibers of the heart wall, sodium enters cells in a carefully timed pattern. The opening of sodium channels initiates each electrical pulse, which then spreads through connected fibers. The regular rhythm of these pulses depends on the surrounding fluid, maintaining a consistent concentration of dissolved salt, so that each wave of sodium entry occurs under predictable conditions. Small shifts in the concentration of sodium in the fluid can change how easily these channels open and close, altering the timing of the electrical pattern that drives each heartbeat. As blood is pushed through the body by the heart, water and dissolved salt move into the small vessels that supply the skin. In warm conditions, or during sustained physical activity, the body releases some of this fluid as sweat. Sweat forms when fluid is filtered from blood plasma into narrow ducts that lead to the skin surface. As the fluid moves through these ducts, some of the dissolved salt is reabsorbed into surrounding tissues, but a portion remains in the liquid that reaches the skin. When the water component of sweat evaporates, the remaining salt can form a thin residue on the surface, leaving behind fine crystals that mark where fluid once flowed. The loss of fluid and salt through sweat changes the composition of the body's remaining fluids. As water leaves the bloodstream and surrounding tissues, the relative concentration of dissolved salt can rise. This shift alters how water moves between compartments, drawing fluid from cells into the surrounding space as the balance adjusts. The change is detected by specialized sensors that respond to the concentration of dissolved particles in the blood. These sensors contribute to the sensation of thirst, encouraging the intake of fluid to restore volume and rebalance concentration. When water is consumed, it enters the bloodstream and spreads into tissues, diluting the dissolved salt and increasing the volume of circulating fluid. The kidneys respond to this change by adjusting how much water and salt they return to the bloodstream during filtration. If the fluid becomes too dilute, more water is allowed to pass into urine, while sodium and chloride are retained to restore concentration. If the fluid becomes too concentrated, additional sodium can be released into urine, allowing the remaining fluid to return toward its usual balance. This continuous adjustment links hydration to salt balance, with both working together to shape the physical environment around muscles and the heart. The movement of water into and out of cells depends on the relative concentration of dissolved salt on either side of cell membranes. When the surrounding fluid becomes more concentrated, water tends to move out of cells, reducing their volume slightly and increasing the concentration of substances inside. When the surrounding fluid becomes more dilute, water moves inward, allowing cells to swell. These changes in cell volume influence how tightly tissues are packed together and how easily blood can pass through narrow vessels that thread between muscle fibers. Even small shifts in fluid balance can alter the spacing between cells, affecting how tissues deform and slide as muscles contract and relax. Hydration therefore involves more than simply replacing lost water. The presence of dissolved salt shapes how effectively added water restores the physical conditions required for steady muscle and heart function. Drinking large volumes of plain water after heavy fluid loss can dilute the concentration of dissolved salt in body fluids, changing the gradients that guide water movement across membranes. In contrast, replacing fluid with solutions that contain some dissolved salt can help restore both volume and concentration together, maintaining the balance that supports predictable electrical signaling and coordinated contraction. The interplay between salt, water, and muscle activity can be pictured in the same way that the tension of cables shapes the movement of a suspension bridge. The cables do not carry the traffic themselves, but they set the conditions under which the structure can flex and respond to changing loads without losing stability. In a similar way, dissolved salt does not generate the force of muscle contraction, yet it establishes the electrical and fluid environment that allows muscle fibers to respond smoothly to incoming signals. When the balance is disturbed, the mechanical response of tissues can become less coordinated, and the steady rhythm of contraction and relaxation can falter. The setting changes, but the physical rules remain in place. As evaporation concentrates mineral at the surface, it resembles thin frost forming on a window pane as warm air meets cold glass, leaving a delicate crust behind. As fluid circulates through vessels, seeps into tissues, and returns to the bloodstream, salt remains part of the shifting mixture that defines the body's internal environment. Sodium and chloride move quietly through narrow channels, across membranes, and along the surfaces of cells, shaping how water distributes itself and how electrical signals propagate. The continuous flow of dissolved salt through these pathways links the physical work of muscles and the rhythmic motion of the heart to the broader circulation of fluid that carries these ions throughout the body. Within the narrow spaces between cells, fluid gathers along thin boundaries that guide movement without stopping it. Salt becomes noticeable to the body long before it enters the bloodstream, beginning at the surface of the tongue, where dissolved particles come into contact with specialized sensory cells. When salt is placed on the tongue, the crystals begin to dissolve in the thin layer of moisture that coats the surface. As sodium separates from chloride and moves into solution, the ions spread across the folds and small bumps of the tongue, reaching clusters of taste cells that line the tiny grooves between them. These cells are arranged in small groups, each exposed to the passing liquid that carries dissolved substances into contact with their outer membranes. Within these taste cells, specific channels allow sodium to enter from the surrounding fluid. As sodium moves inward, it alters the electrical balance of the cell, triggering a signal that travels along connected nerve fibers toward the brain. The change is local and brief, yet the combined activity of many cells across the tongue creates a clear sensory pattern that is recognized as saltiness. The sensation arises from the physical movement of ions into cells, not from the presence of solid crystals themselves. Once dissolved, Salt becomes part of the fluid environment that directly influences the electrical state of the sensory tissue. The ability to detect saltiness appears early in life and is shared across many species. Animals that require mineral intake to support nerve and muscle function benefit from recognizing salty flavors in their environment. The presence of sodium in water or on food surfaces can guide movement towards sources that replenish lost minerals. This sensitivity to salt helps link sensory perception at the tongue to the physical needs of tissues deeper in the body, creating a connection between what is tasted and what is required for internal balance. The perception of saltiness does not exist in isolation. As dissolved sodium spreads across the tongue, it interacts with other taste sensations that arise from different molecules. In small amounts, salt can change how sweet flavors are perceived, making them seem more pronounced. This effect occurs because the electrical changes produced by sodium entry into taste cells alter how signals from neighboring taste receptors are interpreted. The combined pattern of activity across groups of sensory cells shapes the overall impression of flavor, blending saltiness with sweetness or other sensations into a single experience. Salt can also influence how bitter compounds are perceived. When certain bitter molecules reach the tongue, they activate receptors that send signals associated with aversive tastes. The presence of salt can dampen these signals slightly, changing the balance of activity across the taste cells. The physical interaction between dissolved ions and sensory membranes alters how strongly these bitter signals stand out against the background of other tastes. The result is a shift in flavor balance rather than the removal of bitterness itself, adjusting the overall pattern that the brain interprets. Beyond taste, the physical presence of salt crystals affects how food feels in the mouth. Coarse grains press against the surface of the tongue and inner cheeks before dissolving, creating brief points of pressure that register as texture. Finer grains dissolve more quickly, spreading their effect evenly across the moist surface and producing a smoother sensation. The way crystals break down and release dissolved ions shapes both the timing and distribution of sensory input, linking the mechanical contact of solid grains with the chemical signals that follow as they dissolve. The surface of the tongue is covered with small structures that increase the area available for contact with dissolved substances. As liquid moves across these folds, it carries sodium into narrow spaces where taste cells are clustered. The movement of fluid is guided by the shape of the tongue and the action of muscles that shift food and liquid during chewing and swallowing. These small motions spread dissolved salt across different regions of the sensory surface, allowing multiple groups of cells to respond in parallel. When salt guides slow circulation in dense water, it behaves like a gentle slope, guiding a heavy cart, shaping direction without any single push. Craving for salt arises partly from the way the body links sensory input to internal balance. When sodium levels in body fluids fall, changes in the composition of these fluids influence how sensory signals are interpreted and how strongly certain flavors are sought out. The nervous system integrates information from taste receptors with signals from internal sensors that track the concentration of dissolved particles in blood and tissues. The combined input shapes behavior, guiding attention toward flavors that are associated with restoring mineral balance. This connection between internal state and sensory experience can shift over time. When salt intake has been low for extended periods, the response of taste receptors and associated neural pathways can become more sensitive, making salty flavors seem more pronounced. When intake has been high, sensitivity can decrease slightly, altering the perceived intensity of the same concentration of salt. The physical movement of ions into sensory cells remains the same, but the way these signals are weighted and interpreted can change with repeated exposure. This movement carries forward into the next environment without pause. The way salt shapes flavor perception can be compared to the way light levels alter how colors appear in a room. In dim conditions, subtle color differences fade, while in bright light, they become more apparent. The underlying pigments on the walls do not change, but the surrounding conditions alter how clearly they stand out. In a similar way, the presence of dissolved salt changes the sensory environment of the tongue, shifting how other tastes are perceived without altering the chemical nature of the substances themselves. At ground level, the surface appears pale and granular, with fine crystals catching light where shallow water recently thinned under open air. As dissolved salt continues to wash across the tongue and mix with saliva, it moves past sensory cells and is carried toward the throat with the flow of liquid. The ions that triggered sensory signals do not linger in place, but join the stream of fluid that moves into the digestive tract. The brief interaction at the surface of the tongue leaves behind a sensory impression that guides perception and preference, linking the physical movement of dissolved particles to the experience of flavor. When salt comes into contact with food and moisture in the mouth, its physical form shapes how the surface of the tongue and inner cheeks register texture. Before any crystals fully dissolve, they exist as small solid bodies pressing lightly against soft tissue. The tongue is covered in a thin, moist layer that allows grains to slide across its surface, yet each point of contact produces a tiny mechanical sensation. These sensations are brief and local, changing as the crystals shift position and begin to break down in saliva. The size and shape of salt crystals influence how these sensations unfold. Fine grains disperse quickly, spreading across the moist surface in a thin layer that dissolves almost immediately. Because each grain is small, the points of contact are numerous but subtle, producing a gentle, even distribution of pressure that fades as the crystals dissolve. Larger flakes or coarse crystals make fewer points of contact, but each point carries more noticeable pressure before the solid form gives way to solution. The contrast between these physical forms creates different tactile experiences, even when the chemical composition of the salt remains the same. As crystals dissolve, the transition from solid to liquid changes the way the tongue experiences the surface of food. A coarse crystal resting on the tongue creates a brief, concentrated sensation at the point of contact. As it dissolves, that single point of pressure spreads into a broader, softer sensation as dissolved ions mix with saliva and flow across the surface. This shift from localized pressure to diffuse contact changes the timing of sensory input, producing a sequence of sensations rather than a single, static impression. The surface of the tongue is not smooth, but patterned with small folds and ridges that guide the movement of liquid. As saliva flows over these structures, it carries dissolved salt into narrow grooves, where the liquid lingers slightly longer. In these small channels, the concentration of dissolved ions can be momentarily higher, extending the sensation of saltiness and altering how the surface of food feels as it moves across the tongue. The physical shape of the tongue therefore contributes to how texture and flavor are experienced together. The filtering of dissolved salt through layered ground is like water passing through stacked cloth, slowing and separating as it moves from layer to layer. Salt also affects the texture of food itself before it reaches the mouth. When salt is mixed into a dough or rubbed onto the surface of food, it draws water toward itself, changing how moisture is distributed within the material. In some foods, this can tighten the structure by pulling water away from proteins or starches, making the surface firmer. In others, salt can help release moisture from plant tissues, softening cell walls and altering the resistance felt when the food is pressed between teeth. As food is chewed, the movement of the jaw presses solid particles against the tongue and inner surfaces of the mouth. Salt crystals caught between food and tissue can momentarily increase friction, adding a faint sense of graininess before dissolving. The presence of dissolved salt in saliva can also change the slipperiness of the fluid that coats these surfaces, subtly influencing how easily pieces of food slide and reposition as they are worked by the teeth. These small changes in friction and lubrication shape the overall mouthfeel of a bite. The breakdown of salt crystals in saliva can be compared to the way fine sand behaves when mixed with water. Dry sand feels rough and separate, but as water is added, the grains lose their individual edges and become part of a smoother mixture. In the mouth, salt begins as distinct solid points of contact, but as saliva dissolves the crystals, the solid edges soften and disappear, leaving behind a fluid environment that feels smoother against soft tissue. The change in texture unfolds over seconds, linking the mechanical sensation of contact to the chemical process of dissolution. Temperature also influences how texture is perceived. In cooler conditions, saliva moves more slowly across surfaces, allowing solid crystals to remain in contact with the tongue for a little longer before dissolving. In warmer conditions, increased fluid movement speeds the dissolution of salt, shortening the period during which solid contact is felt. The rate at which crystals break down changes the timing of sensory input, subtly altering how texture and flavor are perceived from one moment to the next. As dissolved salt spreads through saliva, it becomes part of the fluid that coats the mouth, changing the way that fluid interacts with surfaces. The thin film of liquid that covers the tongue and inner cheeks provides lubrication, reducing friction as food moves across these tissues. The presence of dissolved ions alters the properties of this film, affecting how tightly it clings to surfaces and how easily it flows. These small changes influence the ease with which the tongue can reposition food during chewing and swallowing. From this setting, the same pattern continues along a different path. Along the edge of a river mouth, darker fresh water glides over denser layers beneath, the surface gently rippled by passing wind. The combined effect of solid contact, dissolution, and fluid movement creates a layered sensory experience. The mouth registers the brief presence of crystals, the shifting distribution of dissolved salt, and the changing slipperiness of saliva as a continuous sequence rather than as separate events. Texture and mouthfeel emerge from this sequence of physical interactions, shaped by the size of crystals, the movement of saliva, and the surfaces of the mouth itself. Salt alters how food changes over time by reshaping the physical environment that surrounds microscopic life on its surface. When food is left exposed in ordinary conditions, moisture within the tissue provides a setting in which bacteria and other microorganisms can grow. These organisms rely on water to move nutrients into their cells and to carry waste products away. The presence of dissolved salt in the surrounding moisture changes how easily water can move between the food and the organisms that settle upon it. When salt is applied to the surface of food, crystals begin to draw moisture outward from the underlying tissue. As water moves toward the salt, it dissolves the crystals, forming a thin, concentrated layer of salty liquid on the surface. This movement of water reduces the amount of free moisture available within the food itself. The surface becomes drier, and the remaining water within the tissue becomes more tightly bound to dissolved particles, changing the conditions under which microorganisms must operate. As ions move through narrow channels in tissue, the flow mirrors grains sliding through a narrow funnel, steady rather than sudden. The salty film that forms on the surface of food creates an environment that is physically challenging for many bacteria. When the surrounding liquid contains a high concentration of dissolved salt, water tends to move out of bacterial cells rather than into them. This movement reduces the internal volume of the cells, altering the tension of their membranes and slowing down internal processes. The microorganisms are not necessarily destroyed at once, but their ability to grow and divide is hindered by the changed balance of water across their cell boundaries. As moisture continues to move from the interior of the food toward the salty surface, the deeper layers gradually lose water as well. The tissue becomes denser and firmer as water leaves the spaces between cells. In meat or fish, fibers draw closer together, changing the texture from soft and yielding to more compact and resilient. The physical structure of the food shifts as water is redistributed, and this structural change itself can make it more difficult for microorganisms to spread inward from the surface. In some preservation methods, food is submerged in brine rather than coated with dry salt. When food is placed in a solution of salt and water, the surrounding liquid already contains a high concentration of dissolved salt. Water moves between the food and the brine until a balance is reached between the concentration inside the tissue and the concentration in the surrounding liquid. During this exchange, dissolved salt penetrates into the outer layers of the food while water moves outward, creating a zone in which the internal moisture content is reduced and the surrounding liquid becomes slightly diluted. The penetration of salt into food alters how internal fluids move through the tissue. As dissolved ions spread inward, they change the way water binds to proteins and other structures within cells. This process can cause the tissue to release additional moisture over time, reinforcing the drying effect that limits microbial growth. The combination of reduced internal moisture and a salty external environment creates a barrier that slows the advance of spoilage from the surface into deeper layers. Preservation with salt also changes how oxygen reaches the interior of food. As the outer layers become denser and less hydrated, the small channels through which gases move can narrow. Reduced gas movement limits the availability of oxygen to microorganisms that rely on it, further slowing their activity. The physical compaction of tissue, combined with altered moisture distribution, reshapes the microenvironment in which spoilage organisms would otherwise thrive. Over longer periods, the repeated movement of water and salt can produce a stable, preserved state in which the internal conditions of the food remain unfavorable for microbial growth. The surface may appear dry and firm, while the interior retains enough moisture to keep the tissue from becoming brittle. The preserved food carries within it a record of how water was drawn outward and salt moved inward, creating gradients of concentration that remain in place as long as the environment stays dry. The effect of salt on preservation can be compared to the way a damp cloth dries when laid out in moving air. As moisture leaves the fibers, the cloth becomes firmer and less pliable, and the conditions that once supported the growth of mildew diminish. In preserved food, salt plays the role of drawing moisture toward the surface, accelerating the shift toward a drier, more stable state that limits the activity of organisms that depend on free water. Inside a warm kitchen space, steam lifts from a pot, while moisture beads along cooler surfaces nearby. This shift in setting does not change the underlying movement of water and dissolved mineral. As preserved foods are stored and later rehydrated or cooked, the movement of water reverses. Moisture can move back into dried tissues, dissolving some of the salt that was previously bound near the surface. This reversal reveals how central the movement of water and salt is to the preservation process. The mineral itself remains present, but its influence depends on how it shapes the distribution of water within and around the food over time. In the way dissolved salt draws water across membranes is like a sponge placed against damp fabric, pulling moisture toward itself without needing to be pressed. Salt plays a subtle but steady role in fermentation by shaping the physical environment in which microorganisms grow and interact with food. When vegetables, grains, or other materials are placed into a container for fermentation, moisture from the food itself or added liquid creates a thin, mobile layer in which bacteria and other microbes can move. As salt dissolves into this liquid, the concentration of dissolved ions changes how easily water moves across the membranes of the microorganisms present, influencing which species can thrive under these conditions. As salt draws water out of plant tissues, it forms a surrounding liquid that carries sugars, enzymes, and other soluble compounds away from the interior of cells. These substances become available to microbes that settle in the liquid, providing material that can be broken down and transformed during fermentation. The gradual release of these compounds shapes the pace at which fermentation proceeds, as the surrounding solution becomes richer in substances that microbes can use as sources of energy. Different microorganisms respond in distinct ways to the presence of salt. Some bacteria tolerate higher salt concentrations and continue to grow, where others slow down or become inactive. As salt alters the balance of species in the fermenting mixture, it guides the sequence of changes that unfold over time. The physical environment becomes selective, favoring organisms that can maintain their internal balance in a salty solution. These organisms shape the character of the ferment by producing acids and other byproducts that further change the conditions within the mixture. As fermentation progresses, acids produced by microbes lower the surrounding pH, altering the chemical environment of the liquid. Salt does not directly create these acids, but by influencing which microbes dominate early in the process, it affects how quickly acidity builds. The rising acidity changes how proteins and plant cell walls behave, softening some structures while tightening others. These changes influence the texture of the fermenting material, shaping how firm or yielding it becomes as the process continues. The presence of dissolved salt also affects the movement of enzymes released from plant cells and microbes. Enzymes function by coming into direct contact with specific molecules in the surrounding liquid. The concentration of salt influences how water organizes itself around these molecules, subtly changing how easily enzymes and their targets encounter one another. The pace of chemical reactions within the fermenting mixture reflects these small physical shifts in how molecules move and interact in solution. As liquid circulates within the fermenting container, either through gentle movement or through the release of gases, dissolved salt spreads evenly throughout the mixture. This even distribution creates a relatively uniform environment in which microbial activity proceeds across the surface and into deeper layers of the food. The physical penetration of salt into plant tissues continues as long as moisture is present, gradually altering the internal composition of the material and shaping how fermentation unfolds within each piece. The control that salt exerts over fermentation can be compared to the way the width of a doorway shapes the flow of people through a room. A narrow opening slows movement and filters who can pass, while a wide opening allows more rapid flow. In the fermenting mixture, salt narrows the range of conditions under which microbes can operate, favoring certain pathways of change while limiting others. The process remains active, but its direction and pace are guided by the physical constraints set by the surrounding solution. As fermentation proceeds over days or weeks, the combined movement of water, dissolved salt, and microbial byproducts reshapes the material at every scale. The outer layers of plant tissues soften as cell walls are altered, while the interior becomes infused with liquid that carries dissolved ions and acids. The boundaries between solid and liquid blur, and the fermenting material becomes a continuous matrix of softened tissue and surrounding solution, shaped by the steady presence of salt. As evaporation concentrates mineral at the surface, it resembles thin frost forming on a window pane as warm air meets cold glass, leaving a delicate crust behind. When fermentation reaches a stable point, the environment within the mixture reflects a balance between dissolved salt, accumulated acids, and reduced availability of easily metabolized sugars. Microbial activity slows as conditions become less favorable for further growth. The preserved state that emerges carries the imprint of the early influence of salt, which shaped the initial flow of water and the selection of microbial communities. The final texture and flavor of the fermented material reflect this long chain of physical and chemical interactions, guided in part by the quiet presence of dissolved salt. Seen from another scale, the same exchange unfolds with quieter force. Salt becomes part of bread long before the loaf enters an oven, shaping the physical behavior of dough as water, flour, and yeast are brought together. When dry flour is mixed with water, the proteins within the flour begin to unfold and link with one another, forming long, elastic strands that stretch and tangle into a flexible network. This network traps pockets of air and gas, giving dough the ability to expand without tearing. As salt dissolves into the moisture within the mixture, it spreads through the developing structure, changing how these protein strands interact with one another. When salt is dissolved, It alters how tightly the protein network holds together. In the absence of salt, the strands can repel one another slightly, leading to a looser, more fragile structure that stretches unevenly. When sodium and chloride ions move into the spaces between the strands, they reduce these repulsive forces, allowing the proteins to draw closer and align more smoothly. The network becomes more cohesive, and the dough develops a firmer, more elastic feel when pressed or stretched by hand. This change in texture is not visible at the scale of individual molecules, yet it can be felt as the dough resists and then yields under gentle pressure. As the dough is kneaded, the movement of hands or mechanical mixers stretches and folds the protein network repeatedly. With each fold, strands that were once separate come into contact and link, strengthening the overall structure. The dissolved salt moves with the moisture through the dough, remaining evenly distributed as the network becomes more organized. The salt does not create the structure itself, but it influences how easily the strands slide past one another and how readily they settle into aligned positions. The physical effort of kneading and the presence of salt together shape the balance between flexibility and strength within the dough. Yeast, when added to the mixture, begins to consume sugars present in the flour, producing carbon dioxide as a byproduct. This gas forms small bubbles that become trapped within the elastic network of proteins. As the bubbles expand, they push outward on the surrounding structure, stretching the network and increasing the volume of the dough. The ability of the dough to hold these expanding pockets depends on the integrity of the protein network. When the network is too weak, bubbles merge and escape, and the dough collapses. When the network is too tight, expansion is restricted, and the dough rises slowly or unevenly. Salt influences this balance by affecting how yeast behaves in the surrounding environment. Dissolved salt changes the movement of water across the membranes of yeast cells, subtly slowing the rate at which they take in sugars and release byproducts. This moderation of yeast activity prevents the production of gas from becoming too rapid, allowing the protein network time to stretch and reorganize around expanding bubbles. The result is a steadier rise in which gas pockets are distributed more evenly throughout the dough rather than forming large, unstable voids. As fermentation proceeds, the internal structure of the dough becomes a matrix of solid strands surrounding pockets of gas and liquid. The dissolved salt remains part of the moisture within this matrix, influencing how water binds to proteins and starches. The presence of ions alters the way water molecules arrange themselves around these larger structures, changing how freely the strands can move relative to one another. This subtle shift in mobility affects how the dough responds when pressed, folded, or shaped, contributing to the tactile qualities that bakers sense as smoothness, elasticity, or resistance. When the shaped dough enters the oven, heat begins to change the physical state of its components. The gas trapped within bubbles expands as it warms, pushing outward on the surrounding network. At the same time, the proteins in the dough begin to firm and set as their structure changes with rising temperature. The dissolved salt, still present in the moisture within the dough, continues to influence how water moves as heat drives some of it into vapor. The combination of expanding gas and setting structure fixes the shape of the loaf, preserving the pattern of pores that formed during fermentation. When salt guides slow circulation in dense water, it behaves like a gentle slope, guiding a heavy cart, shaping direction without any single push. As water evaporates from the surface of the dough during baking, the outer layer dries and hardens, forming a crust. Salt near the surface becomes more concentrated as moisture leaves, influencing how the surface proteins and starches rearrange as they set. The changing distribution of moisture and dissolved ions shapes how the crust develops its firmness and texture. In areas where the surface dries more quickly, the crust becomes crisp and rigid, while regions that retain more moisture remain softer for longer during the baking process. Inside the loaf, the gradual movement of heat drives water from cooler regions toward warmer ones. This internal migration of moisture carries dissolved salt along with it, creating small gradients of concentration between the center and the outer layers. As the loaf cools after baking, water redistributes again, softening some areas while leaving others firmer. The final texture of the crumb reflects this history of movement, shaped by the interplay between water, dissolved salt, and the network of proteins that once stretched around growing gas bubbles. Within the narrow spaces between cells, fluid gathers along thin boundaries that guide movement without stopping it. The role of salt in bread can be compared to the tensioning of ropes in a net. A net without evenly distributed tension sags in some areas and tears in others, failing to hold its shape when weight is applied. When tension is adjusted across the net, the structure can support distributed loads without collapsing. In dough, salt helps regulate the balance of forces within the protein network, allowing it to stretch around expanding gas bubbles without breaking or tightening too abruptly. The mineral does not replace the physical work of kneading or the action of yeast, but it helps set the conditions under which these processes unfold smoothly. As the loaf cools and is later cut, the crumb reveals the pattern of pores left behind by the trapped gas. The distribution of these pores reflects the steady expansion that occurred during fermentation and baking. The presence of salt during the early stages helps shape this pattern by moderating yeast activity and strengthening the protein network that held the bubbles in place. Each slice carries the imprint of these physical interactions, showing how dissolved ions, water movement, and structural rearrangement combine to transform a mixture of flour and water into a stable, porous solid. Even as the setting shifts, the same physical rules continue to apply. Salt has shaped human movement and settlement in ways that are easy to overlook, because the mineral itself is small and easily scattered. Long before modern transport or refrigeration, access to salt influenced where communities formed and how far people could travel. When food could be preserved for longer periods using salt, groups were no longer limited to consuming what they could gather or hunt within a short time. Salt, in its physical form, created in certain locations, created points of attraction where people returned repeatedly, building paths between sources and settlements. In regions where salt was abundant at the surface, such as near coastal flats or exposed deposits inland, people could collect it with relatively simple tools. Crusts that formed after water evaporated could be lifted and carried away, while shallow layers of mineral could be scraped from the ground and dried for storage. The ease of access in these locations allowed salt to become part of daily routines, incorporated into food preparation and preservation practices that extended the usable life of fish, meat, and plant materials. In areas where salt was buried deeper underground, Reaching it required organized effort. Excavating mineral layers demanded sustained labor and the coordination of groups to remove surrounding rock. The physical difficulty of accessing these deposits shaped early mining practices, with shafts and tunnels cut into the ground to follow seams of salt. The spaces carved out in this way became part of the landscape, leaving behind cavities that marked the places where generations of work had removed mineral layers from beneath the surface. Once collected, salt had to be moved. Carriers transported it in sacks or baskets, balancing loads across their shoulders or packing it onto animals for longer journeys. As these routes were used repeatedly, narrow tracks widened into roads, worn by the movement of people and goods across the same ground. The repeated passage of feet, hooves and wheels pressed paths into the landscape, linking salt sources to distant settlements. Over time, these routes became established corridors of movement that connected regions with different resources. The filtering of dissolved salt through layered ground is like water passing through stacked cloth, slowing and separating as it moves from layer to layer. The physical form of salt made it suitable for long-distance trade. As a dry mineral, it could be packed tightly without spoiling, and its value remained stable as long as it was kept dry. Blocks or sacks of salt could be stored for months or years, making it possible to accumulate reserves that could be drawn upon when fresh supplies were scarce. The ability to store and transport salt over long distances extended the reach of communities, allowing inland settlements to access a mineral that did not occur naturally in their immediate surroundings. As trade networks expanded, salt became woven into patterns of exchange that included metals, textiles, and other materials. The movement of salt along established routes encouraged the growth of trading centers, where goods were gathered, exchanged, and redistributed. These centers often formed at crossroads or near river crossings, where transport was easier and the flow of goods could be managed. The steady movement of salt through these points contributed to the emergence of marketplaces and the clustering of populations around reliable sources of exchange. The presence of salt in trade also influenced the organization of labor and authority. Controlling access to salt sources or regulating its distribution along trade routes allowed certain groups to shape the flow of goods and resources. Guarded paths, toll points, and storage sites emerged along major routes, reflecting the need to manage and protect valuable cargo. The physical infrastructure that developed around salt transport left marks on the landscape in the form of fortified settlements, roads, and depots built to handle the movement and storage of mineral supplies. Salt's role in food preservation extended its influence beyond trade into patterns of seasonal movement. Communities that relied on preserved food could remain in one place through periods when fresh resources were scarce. The ability to store salted fish or meat reduced the need for constant migration in search of food, allowing settlements to become more permanent. Over time, this stability supported the development of more complex social structures tied to fixed locations as people invested labor in building dwellings, storage facilities, and communal spaces. At ground level, the surface appears pale and granular, with fine crystals catching light where shallow water recently thinned under open air. The link between salt and the shaping of routes and settlements can be compared to the way a steady flow of water carves channels through soil. At first, small trickles follow irregular paths, but as the same routes are used repeatedly, shallow grooves deepen into clear channels that guide future movement. In a similar way, the repeated transport of salt along certain paths gradually established durable routes that shaped how people moved across the land. The mineral itself did not dictate the exact course of these paths, but its consistent movement through particular corridors helped define the channels of trade and communication that connected distant communities. As generations passed, the physical pathways created for salt transport became part of broader networks of travel and exchange. Roads that once carried sacks of mineral also carried people, ideas, and other goods, linking regions in patterns that outlasted the specific trade that first brought them into being. The quiet movement of salt across these routes left behind a durable imprint on the shape of human settlement, etched into the ground in the form of paths that continued to guide movement long after their original purpose had expanded. Salt has shaped patterns of power not because of any symbolic meaning, but because it exists unevenly across landscapes and must be physically moved from where it forms to where it is needed. In regions where salt appears naturally at the surface, people could gather it with little more than time and simple tools. In inland areas, where no natural deposits were available, salt had to be carried in from distant coasts or extracted from deep underground layers. This uneven distribution created physical dependencies between regions, binding communities together through routes of transport that carried the mineral across long distances. This movement carries forward into the next environment without pause. As these routes were used repeatedly, they became worn paths through forests, across plains, and along river valleys. The repeated passage of people and animals carrying heavy loads pressed tracks into the ground, turning narrow trails into established roads. These routes did not wander randomly. They followed the easiest gradients through the terrain, skirting steep slopes, seeking shallow river crossings, and threading through mountain passes, where the ground allowed steady movement. Over time, the physical geography of salt transport shaped corridors of travel that connected distant regions in durable patterns. As ions move through narrow channels in tissue, the flow mirrors grains sliding through a narrow funnel, steady rather than sudden. Along these corridors, certain points became natural places for storage and exchange. Where routes intersected or where journeys paused for rest, sacks of salt were stacked under shelter to keep them dry. These storage sites gradually developed into permanent structures, with thick walls and raised floors designed to keep moisture from seeping in. The presence of stored salt concentrated material value in specific locations, and those who managed these sites gained influence over when and how supplies were released onward. Control over storage became control over continuity of supply, tying authority to the physical management of space and material. The need to protect these stored supplies and the routes that carried them altered the built environment. Walls were raised around depots, gates were placed at entry points to narrow corridors of travel, and watch posts were positioned at river crossings and mountain passes. These structures guided movement by forcing travelers and traders to pass through controlled points. The landscape itself became channeled, with roads narrowing into bottlenecks where access could be monitored. The mineral itself did not create these barriers, but its steady movement through particular paths encouraged the construction of physical controls that shaped how people moved through the land. As salt moved through these controlled corridors, it linked distant regions into systems of dependence. Inland communities that relied on preserved food depended on regular deliveries of salt to maintain their supplies. When routes were disrupted by weather, conflict, or natural obstacles, the physical absence of salt was felt in everyday routines. Food that would otherwise be stored began to spoil more quickly, and the effort required to secure new supplies increased. These disruptions were experienced at the level of households and storage rooms, making the continuity of supply a tangible concern tied to the physical movement of goods. The organization of labor around salt transport further shaped patterns of authority. Groups of carriers were needed to move loads across long distances, and their work required coordination, rest points, and protection along the way. Animals used for carrying loads needed water and shelter, shaping the placement of stopping points along routes. The rhythm of movement along these corridors created predictable flows of people and material, and those who could organize and maintain these flows held practical influence over the functioning of regional networks. As these systems grew, the infrastructure built to manage salt transport began to support the movement of other goods as well. Roads widened to accommodate increased traffic, bridges were reinforced to bear heavier loads, and storage buildings were adapted to hold a variety of materials. What began as routes shaped by the need to move a specific mineral evolved into broader networks of transport that connected settlements through shared pathways. The physical presence of these routes continued to guide movement even as the range of materials carried along them expanded. The shaping of power through salt can be compared to the way a narrow mountain pass controls movement through a range. The pass does not determine where people wish to go, but it dictates the path they must take to cross the terrain. Those who manage access to the pass influence the flow of travelers and goods through the region. In a similar way, control over salt routes and storage sites influenced how material moved across landscapes, shaping patterns of access and dependence through the physical constraints of terrain and infrastructure. Along the edge of a river mouth, darker freshwater glides over denser layers beneath, the surface gently rippled by passing wind. Over time, settlements that grew around these controlled points developed more complex administrative structures. Buildings for record-keeping, storage, and oversight clustered near depots and checkpoints, forming centers where decisions about movement and distribution were made. The presence of these centers drew additional activity as craftspeople, traders, and laborers gathered around places where goods flowed steadily. The physical concentration of people and materials in these hubs reinforced their importance within the regional network, tying authority to specific locations in the built environment. As routes extended and networks became more interconnected, the boundaries between regions began to reflect the corridors of movement shaped by salt transport. Areas linked by reliable routes developed shared patterns of exchange, while regions separated by difficult terrain or disrupted pathways remained more isolated. The minerals movement helped carve lines of connection and separation across the landscape, with physical routes defining zones of influence that could persist even as the materials being traded changed over time. The way dissolved salt draws water across membranes is like a sponge placed against damp fabric, pulling moisture toward itself without needing to be pressed. The influence of salt on political control did not depend on formal declarations or abstract authority. It emerged from the repeated physical act of moving a necessary material through constrained pathways, building infrastructure to protect and manage that movement, and concentrating resources in specific locations. The quiet repetition of these actions over generations left behind roads, depots, crossings, and settlements that continued to shape how people moved and interacted. The mineral itself passed through these structures, but the structures remained, guiding the flow of people and goods long after the specific pressures of salt supply had shifted. From here, the same pattern continues along a slightly different path. Salt continues to move through modern diets in forms that are often less visible than the crystals scattered on a surface, yet its physical presence remains woven into how food is prepared, stored, and consumed. In many settings, salt is already dissolved within foods by the time they are eaten, having been mixed into sauces, soups, and processed ingredients. The dissolved ions spread through the moisture within these foods, becoming part of the liquid that coats the tongue and enters the digestive tract with each bite. When salt enters the body through food, the sodium and chloride separate in the fluid of the digestive system and pass through the lining of the intestine into the bloodstream. The absorption of these ions occurs across thin layers of cells that form a barrier between the contents of the gut and the circulating blood. Sodium moves through specific channels and transporters embedded in these cell membranes, joining the dissolved particles that circulate with blood plasma. The physical passage of ions across these membranes links dietary intake to the composition of fluids that bathe tissues throughout the body. Modern food preparation often distributes salt evenly through large volumes of material, altering how the mineral is encountered at the sensory level. In foods where salt is mixed throughout, the dissolved ions are present in nearly every mouthful, producing a steady sensory signal rather than brief, localized bursts associated with surface crystals. This even distribution changes the timing and intensity of sensory input, creating a more continuous pattern of saltiness as food is chewed and swallowed. The physical mixing of salt into food matrices shapes how the mineral is perceived and how consistently it enters the body. The movement of sodium through the bloodstream following a meal changes the concentration of dissolved ions in body fluids. As blood carries these ions into tissues, the balance between fluid compartments adjusts, with water shifting in response to the changing concentration of dissolved particles. The kidneys respond by filtering blood and selectively returning sodium and water to the circulation or allowing excess to pass into urine. This continuous filtering links dietary intake to the physical movement of fluid through the body, shaping how volume and concentration are maintained over time. The steady presence of salt in many prepared foods alters the rhythm of intake across the day. Instead of receiving sodium in occasional concentrated doses, the body may encounter smaller amounts distributed across multiple meals and snacks. Each intake adds to the dissolved pool of ions in circulation, and the cumulative effect shapes how often regulatory systems must adjust fluid balance. The physical processes of absorption, circulation, and filtration repeat with each instance of intake, maintaining a dynamic equilibrium that reflects recent consumption patterns. As the concentration of dissolved sodium in body fluids changes, it influences how water moves between compartments. An increase in sodium concentration draws water into the bloodstream from surrounding tissues, expanding circulating volume. A decrease allows water to move back into tissues. These shifts alter the pressure within blood vessels and the spacing between cells, affecting how easily blood flows through fine capillaries and how tissues are supplied with oxygen and nutrients. The physical movement of fluid in response to dissolved salt links dietary patterns to the mechanical conditions under which circulation operates. Long-term patterns of intake shape how regulatory systems operate. When sodium intake remains consistently high, the kidneys adjust their handling of filtered ions, altering how much sodium is returned to the bloodstream and how much is excreted. The tissues that line blood vessels respond to sustained changes in fluid composition, with subtle alterations in how vessel walls accommodate shifting volumes. These changes are not abrupt, but accumulate gradually as the physical environment of cells adapts to the prevailing balance of water and dissolved particles. Inside a warm kitchen space, steam lifts from a pot while moisture beads along cooler surfaces nearby. As evaporation concentrates mineral at the surface, it resembles thin frost forming on a window pane as warm air meets cold glass, leaving a delicate crust behind. The relationship between salt and health in modern diets can be pictured in the same way that the steady loading of a structure shapes how it settles over time. A bridge that carries a constant flow of traffic adapts to the repeated stress, with small adjustments in how materials bear weight. In the body, the repeated movement of dissolved salt and water through vessels and tissues creates a persistent pattern of loading on regulatory systems. The structures that manage filtration, circulation, and fluid balance adjust to this pattern, shaping how the system responds to changes in intake over long periods. The physical form in which salt enters the diet also matters. When salt is dissolved in liquids or mixed evenly into food, it spreads quickly through the digestive tract and into circulation. When it appears as surface crystals on solid food, dissolution may occur more locally at the tongue before the ions are carried inward with saliva. These differences in physical presentation shape the timing of absorption and the sensory cues associated with intake, linking the experience of eating to the subsequent movement of ions through the body. As modern diets continue to distribute salt across a wide range of foods, the mineral remains part of the background composition of daily intake rather than an occasional addition. The steady flow of dissolved ions through the digestive tract into the bloodstream and onward through filtration systems continues to shape the physical environment of tissues. The body responds to this flow through ongoing adjustments in fluid movement, linking patterns of diet to the mechanics of circulation and the balance of water across compartments. Salt does not affect every body in exactly the same way, because the physical structures that move sodium and chloride through tissues vary slightly from person to person. At the surface of cells, the channels and transporters that guide ions across membranes differ in how readily they open, how long they remain active, and how quickly they move particles from one side to the other. These small structural differences influence the rate at which dissolved salt enters cells and the pace at which it is removed again, shaping how fluid balance is maintained under changing conditions. This shift in setting does not change the underlying movement of water and dissolved mineral. Within the lining of the intestine, transport proteins that move sodium from the contents of the gut into the bloodstream vary in their efficiency. In some bodies, these transporters draw sodium inward more readily, allowing dissolved ions to pass into circulation quickly after intake. In others, the movement is slower, and a greater proportion of sodium remains within the digestive tract for longer before being absorbed. This variation in uptake shapes how rapidly blood concentrations change following a meal, altering the timing of fluid shifts between compartments. The kidneys contain a dense network of tiny tubules lined with transporters that reclaim sodium from the forming urine. These structures do not operate identically in all individuals. Differences in the arrangement and responsiveness of transporters along the tubules influence how much sodium is returned to the bloodstream and how much is allowed to leave the body. As fluid passes through the kidney, the pattern of reabsorption shapes the final concentration of dissolved salt in the urine, reflecting how each body balances retention against release under similar conditions. At the level of blood vessels, the tissues that line the inner surface respond to the composition of surrounding fluid. When sodium concentrations shift, the cells that form vessel walls adjust how they regulate the passage of water and ions between blood and surrounding tissue. Variations in how these cells respond to changes in fluid composition can alter how readily vessels accommodate shifts in volume. Some vessel walls relax more easily as fluid volume increases, while others respond with greater stiffness, changing the physical conditions under which blood flows through the network of channels that supply tissues. The distribution of salt within body fluids influences how water moves into and out of cells. Differences in membrane composition and the density of transport proteins alter how quickly water follows dissolved ions across cell boundaries. In some individuals, cells exchange water with surrounding fluid more readily, allowing volumes to adjust quickly as salt concentrations change. In others, the movement is slower, and the adjustment to altered conditions takes longer to unfold. These differences affect how tissues respond to shifts in hydration and salt intake over short periods. When salt guides slow circulation in dense water, it behaves like a gentle slope guiding a heavy cart, shaping direction without any single push. Sweat glands also show variation in how they handle dissolved salt. As fluid passes through the narrow ducts that lead to the skin surface, some salt is reabsorbed into surrounding tissue before the sweat emerges. The efficiency of this reabsorption differs between individuals, altering how much salt is lost in sweat under similar conditions. The physical length and structure of the ducts, along with the activity of transport proteins lining their walls, shape how much sodium remains in the fluid that reaches the surface of the skin. Across a dry inland flat, faint crusts crack underfoot, revealing softer layers that shift when weight settles. The combined effect of these variations creates different patterns of salt movement through the body. Two people exposed to the same intake and the same environmental conditions may experience slightly different shifts in fluid distribution, urine composition, and sweat loss. The physical pathways that carry dissolved ions through tissues are similar in overall design, yet their detailed properties differ enough to shape how each body manages the same material under comparable circumstances. The way these variations influence salt handling can be compared to the way different drainage systems manage rainfall in similar landscapes. Two regions may receive the same amount of rain, yet differences in the width of channels, the permeability of soil, and the arrangement of slopes lead to different patterns of runoff and retention. In the body, the movement of dissolved salt and water follows channels and membranes whose structure shapes how fluid is directed and stored. Small differences in these pathways can lead to noticeable differences in how the system responds to similar inputs. Over longer periods, the physical properties of these transport systems shape how the body adapts to habitual patterns of intake. Regular exposure to certain levels of salt leads regulatory systems to adjust the activity of transporters and channels, altering how quickly ions are moved and how strongly retention mechanisms operate. These adjustments are grounded in physical changes at the level of cell membranes and transport proteins, gradually tuning the system to the prevailing conditions under which it operates. As dissolved salt continues to circulate through blood, pass into tissues, and return through filtration systems, the subtle differences in how these pathways are structured remain in effect. The mineral itself is the same in every body, yet the routes it takes and the pace at which it moves vary with the physical properties of the tissues it passes through. These variations shape the individual pattern of salt handling, linking the shared chemical nature of the mineral to the unique physical structure of each body. Salt harvesting reshapes landscapes by altering how water moves across the surface and how soil and sediment settle in shallow basins. In coastal regions, where seawater is channeled into evaporation ponds, low walls are built to guide the flow of water into flat, shallow compartments. As water enters these basins, it spreads into thin sheets that warm quickly under sunlight. The repeated filling and drying of these shallow pools changes the physical structure of the ground beneath, compacting fine sediments and leaving behind layers of crystallized salt that coat the surface. As water evaporates from these ponds, dissolved salt concentrates and settles out as solid crystals. These crystals form crusts that harden the surface of the basins, altering how subsequent flows of water spread across the ground. Instead of soaking into soft sediment, incoming water runs across the hardened surface, changing patterns of drainage and erosion. Over time, the repeated cycle of evaporation and crystallization reshapes the microtopography of the ponds, creating a patchwork of hardened plates separated by shallow channels where water continues to collect. Seen from another scale, the same exchange unfolds with quieter force. The diversion of seawater into evaporation ponds changes the movement of water in surrounding wetlands and coastal flats. Channels cut to guide water into harvesting basins alter the natural spread of tides and surface flows. Areas that once received regular flushing by seawater may become isolated, while other areas receive concentrated flows that change sediment deposition patterns. The redistribution of water changes how fine particles settle out of suspension, altering the texture and elevation of the ground over time. The filtering of dissolved salt through layered ground is like water passing through stacked cloth, slowing and separating as it moves from layer to layer. Inland salt extraction through mining reshapes the subsurface in a different way. When salt layers are removed from beneath the ground, empty spaces remain where solid mineral once supported the weight of overlying rock. These voids can alter how the surrounding material bears load, sometimes leading to gradual subsidence at the surface, as layers above shift downward to fill the empty space. The slow settling of ground changes drainage patterns on the surface, redirecting the flow of rainwater and reshaping the contours of the landscape over long periods. The removal of salt from underground layers also changes how groundwater moves through the subsurface. Salt deposits can act as relatively impermeable barriers to water flow. When they are removed, pathways open that allow water to move into spaces that were previously sealed. This change in subsurface flow alters how water is stored and transported beneath the surface, potentially shifting the distribution of moisture in surrounding soils. As water moves through newly opened channels, it can dissolve residual mineral from exposed surfaces, carrying dissolved salt into surrounding groundwater. The accumulation of salty runoff from evaporation ponds or mined areas changes the composition of nearby soils and surface waters. As rainwater flows across hardened salt crusts, it dissolves some of the mineral and carries it into adjacent areas. The dissolved salt spreads through shallow streams and into low-lying ground, altering how water interacts with soil particles. The increased concentration of dissolved ions can change how soil aggregates hold together, affecting how easily the ground erodes or compacts under repeated wetting and drying. Within the narrow spaces between cells, fluid gathers along thin boundaries that guide movement without stopping it. In areas where salt harvesting is sustained over long periods, the surrounding vegetation is influenced by the changing chemical and physical properties of the soil. Plants rooted in ground that receives salty runoff encounter altered moisture conditions, as dissolved salt changes how water moves into and out of root tissues. The physical stress placed on roots by the surrounding solution can alter growth patterns, leading to changes in how plant communities are distributed across the landscape. The shifting balance between salt-tolerant and salt-sensitive species reflects the physical conditions created by altered water movement, rather than any symbolic effect of the mineral itself. The transformation of landscapes through salt harvesting can be compared to the way repeated scraping alters the surface of a clay field. Each pass leaves behind small changes in texture and contour, and over time, the accumulated effect reshapes how water pools and drains across the surface. In evaporation ponds and mining sites, the repeated removal and redeposition of salt alters the fine structure of the ground, changing how water spreads, drains, and carries sediment from one place to another. As salt continues to be harvested and transported, the physical footprint of extraction remains embedded in the terrain. Hardened pond surfaces, altered drainage channels, and subsurface cavities persist long after active extraction slows or ceases. These features continue to influence how water moves across and beneath the ground, shaping erosion patterns and moisture distribution. The mineral itself leaves the site in the form of transported salt, but the changes made to the landscape remain, guiding the movement of water and sediment long after the original material has been removed. Salt shapes entire living environments in places where water and mineral content combine to create conditions that differ sharply from those of surrounding landscapes. In coastal flats, inland salt lakes, and shallow basins where evaporation concentrates dissolved minerals, The ground often appears pale and crusted, with thin layers of crystal forming across the surface. The soil beneath these crusts holds water that is heavy with dissolved salt, and the air above can feel dry as moisture is drawn upward and carried away. These physical conditions shape how plants and animals can occupy the space, defining which forms of life can maintain their internal balance in the presence of concentrated mineral solutions. Plants that grow in salty ground encounter a surrounding solution that draws water away from their tissues. As moisture in the soil becomes rich in dissolved salt, the movement of water into roots slows, and in some cases, water can move out of root cells into the surrounding ground. To continue drawing water inward, these plants adjust the concentration of dissolved substances within their own cells, increasing the density of internal fluids so that water is pulled back across cell membranes. This internal adjustment changes the physical environment within plant tissues, influencing how cells maintain their shape and how the thin walls between them hold together under altered pressure. As ions move through narrow channels in tissue, the flow mirrors grains sliding through a narrow funnel, steady rather than sudden. The roots of salt-tolerant plants often extend through layers of soil where salinity varies with depth. Near the surface, evaporating water leaves higher concentrations of salt behind, while deeper layers may hold fresher moisture. As roots grow downward, they pass through gradients of dissolved mineral, encountering zones where water is easier to draw in and zones where the surrounding solution resists inward movement. The physical structure of the root system, with branching tips and fine hairs, spreads contact across a wide area, increasing the chances of encountering pockets of less concentrated moisture that can be drawn into the plant. The setting changes, but the physical rules remain in place. As water moves into salt-tolerant plants, dissolved minerals can accumulate within tissues. Some species store excess salt in specialized compartments within their cells, isolating it from the machinery that carries out everyday functions. Others transport salt toward the edges of leaves, where it can be deposited on the surface and later removed by wind or rain. These physical pathways move dissolved ions through the plant body, directing them away from sensitive internal structures and toward areas where their presence is less disruptive. Animals that inhabit salty environments face similar challenges in maintaining water balance. In shallow salt lakes or coastal flats, the surrounding water can contain higher concentrations of dissolved mineral than the fluids within the animal's body. When an animal's skin or internal surfaces come into contact with this water, the surrounding solution tends to draw water outward from tissues. To counter this, the animal's internal fluids maintain a higher concentration of dissolved substances, reducing the net movement of water out of cells. The surfaces that separate internal fluids from the surrounding environment are structured to regulate the movement of ions and water, allowing selective passage that supports internal balance. Birds that feed in saline wetlands, for example, take in water and food that carry dissolved salt. The salt enters the bloodstream and must be managed to prevent excessive loss of water from tissues. Specialized glands located near the head collect excess salt from the blood and release it as concentrated droplets. These droplets form at the surface of narrow ducts and can be seen as small beads of liquid that are shed from the body. The physical routing of salt through these glands allows the bird to drink salty water without accumulating excessive mineral within its tissues. Small aquatic organisms living in briny water experience constant movement of ions across their outer membranes. The surrounding solution presses inward, and the cells respond by adjusting the concentration of dissolved substances within their interiors. The membranes that separate internal fluids from the environment contain channels that regulate the passage of sodium and chloride, allowing excess to be expelled while retaining enough to maintain internal balance. The continual adjustment of ion movement shapes how water enters and leaves the cells, allowing these organisms to survive in environments that would otherwise draw moisture out of their tissues. At ground level, the surface appears pale and granular, with fine crystals catching light where shallow water recently thinned under open air. The physical structure of saline environments also influences how organisms move and settle within them. In salt flats, the hardened crust at the surface can break underfoot, revealing softer layers beneath that shift and settle when weight is applied. Animals moving across these surfaces experience alternating regions of firm support and yielding ground, shaping how they place their weight and how their limbs or feet distribute pressure. The repeated movement of bodies across these crusts creates patterns of cracks and compacted zones that alter how water collects and evaporates, feeding back into the structure of the habitat itself. In shallow salt lakes, the density of the water changes with salt concentration, influencing how objects float or sink. Water rich in dissolved mineral is denser than fresher water, allowing small organisms and floating debris to remain near the surface more easily. The buoyant support provided by dense brine shapes how organisms position themselves in the water column, with some species spending long periods near the surface where light and oxygen are more available. The physical relationship between body density and water density guides movement within the layered environment of the lake. The adaptations that allow life to persist in salty places can be compared to the way a sealed container preserves liquid under pressure. The container does not change the liquid itself, but its walls maintain a boundary that resists the outward movement of contents. In living tissues, cell membranes and specialized structures act as boundaries that resist the movement of water and ions imposed by the surrounding solution. By maintaining these boundaries and adjusting internal concentrations, organisms preserve the conditions needed for their internal processes to continue even when the external environment would otherwise disrupt them. As salt continues to concentrate and disperse with cycles of evaporation and flooding, the physical conditions of saline environments shift. After rainfall, surface salinity can decrease temporarily as fresh water spreads across crusted ground or mixes into shallow pools. As the water evaporates again, dissolved mineral returns to the surface, reforming crusts and restoring high salinity. Organisms living in these settings experience these shifts as changes in how water moves across their tissues and how strongly the surrounding solution draws moisture away. The ability to endure repeated changes in concentration reflects the flexibility of their physical structures and the regulation of ion movement across their boundaries. The presence of life in salty places demonstrates how the movement of water and dissolved mineral shapes entire ecosystems at the level of cells, tissues, and landscapes. The mineral does not act alone, but as part of a physical environment that presses against the boundaries of living structures. The organisms that persist in these settings do so by reshaping the internal pathways through which water and ions move, maintaining a workable balance between their internal fluids and the surrounding brine. The resulting patterns of growth and movement leave visible marks on the surface of salt flats and lakes, tracing the paths along which life adapts to the persistent presence of dissolved salt. Salt links together systems that are often considered separately by shaping how water moves, how materials circulate, and how physical boundaries are maintained across environments. In the ocean, dissolved salt alters the density of water, guiding slow movements that carry heat across large distances. In the atmosphere, water that evaporates from salty surfaces leaves the mineral behind, concentrating it in soils and basins. On land, the presence of salt in ground and water changes how moisture moves through soil and how plants and microbes interact with their surroundings. These movements form a continuous exchange between ocean, air, land, and living tissue, with salt acting as a quiet participant in each transfer. When seawater evaporates from shallow basins, the salt that remains behind becomes part of the land. Crystals accumulate on exposed surfaces, and wind can lift fine particles of mineral into the air. These particles travel with moving air masses, settling again when conditions change. In this way, salt migrates not only through liquid pathways, but also through the atmosphere, connecting distant regions through fine drifting grains. The movement of salt through air links coastal environments to inland landscapes, adding small amounts of mineral to soils far from the sea. As rain falls on land, it dissolves salts that have accumulated on surfaces and carries them into streams and rivers. These waters gather the dissolved mineral from across broad catchments, combining contributions from soil, rock, and atmospheric deposition. The flow of rivers returns salt to the sea, closing a loop that ties land and ocean together through the continual movement of dissolved material. Along this pathway, salt passes through countless physical boundaries, crossing from solid surfaces into liquid streams and back again into crystalline form when water evaporates. Within living organisms, salt participates in similar cycles of movement. Water entering the body carries dissolved ions into tissues, where they shape the electrical and fluid environment of cells. Excess salt is released through sweat, urine, and other fluids, returning mineral to the surrounding environment. As these fluids evaporate or mix with soil and surface water, the ions rejoin broader cycles of movement across the landscape. The exchange between internal and external environments links the physiology of organisms to the circulation of materials in the wider world. The physical presence of salt in soil influences how microbes break down organic matter and how nutrients move through ground layers. As dissolved ions alter how water binds to particles, they change the spacing between grains of sediment and the pathways through which fluid flows. This reshaping of pore spaces affects how oxygen moves into the soil and how carbon-rich compounds move downward toward deeper layers. The mineral content of the soil therefore shapes how energy and matter are cycled through the ground, connecting surface processes to subsurface transformations. In rivers and estuaries, where fresh water meets seawater, gradients of salt concentration form layered environments in which materials mix slowly. Fresh water flowing outward rides above denser saline water moving inward, creating zones where dissolved substances accumulate and settle. Fine particles carried by rivers can become trapped in these layers, sinking as the surrounding water becomes denser. These boundary zones act as filters that shape where sediments and nutrients are deposited, influencing the growth of wetlands and the structure of coastal margins. The layering created by salt gradients therefore shapes the physical form of landscapes at the boundary between land and sea. The movement of salt through built environments adds another layer to these connections. In cities and along transport corridors, salt applied to roads dissolves into runoff that flows into drains and streams. This runoff carries dissolved ions into urban soils and waterways, altering how water moves through these constructed landscapes. The mineral enters the same pathways that carry rainfall from roofs and pavement into natural channels, merging human activity with broader hydrological cycles. The physical routing of water through engineered systems becomes another way in which salt moves between land and water. The link between salt and movement across systems can be compared to the way hinges connect the parts of a folding screen. Each panel has its own surface and function, but the hinges allow the panels to move in relation to one another, creating a continuous structure that can be opened or closed. Salt acts as a hinge between different physical domains, connecting ocean to land, land to living tissue, and living tissue back to the wider environment through cycles of dissolution and deposition. The mineral itself does not drive these movements, but its presence shapes how water and matter pass across boundaries. Over long periods, the circulation of salt contributes to the shaping of geological layers. As water evaporates from inland seas and basins, thick deposits of salt accumulate and are later buried beneath sediments. These layers influence how groundwater moves and how pressure is distributed within the Earth's crust. When erosion or tectonic movement later exposes these deposits, the mineral re-enters surface cycles, dissolving into flowing water and spreading once more across landscapes. The physical layering of salt within rock records past connections between water and land, preserving traces of earlier environments within the structure of the ground. The movement of salt also links energy flows across systems. In the ocean, differences in salinity contribute to the slow circulation that redistributes heat. On land, salt influences how moisture is retained or lost from soil, shaping how much solar energy is absorbed or reflected at the surface. Within organisms, salt shapes how electrical signals propagate and how fluids distribute heat through tissues. Across these scales, the mineral helps guide the pathways through which energy moves, connecting physical processes in water, air, ground, and living bodies. Taken together, these pathways show how a simple mineral becomes woven into the movement of water and energy across the planet. Salt crosses boundaries between solid and liquid, between surface and subsurface, between environment and organism. Each passage leaves small changes in structure and flow, shaping how materials accumulate, disperse, and circulate over time. The mineral does not stand apart from these systems, but moves within them, linking processes that operate at very different scales into a continuous physical exchange. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you have enjoyed spending time learning about salt. For now, the focus rests on how a small crystal moves. Water carries it, air lifts traces of it, and living tissue draws it inward and releases it again. By following these movements, the shape of entire environments begins to come into view, from coastlines and river mouths to the spaces between cells where fluids quietly shift in response to dissolved minerals. Over the course of this story, the same mineral will reappear in places that seem far removed from open water. It will pass through soil and into the roots of plants, travel through the fluids of the human body, and gather along the routes where people once moved food and materials across landscapes. These connections will emerge gradually, as the same physical rules repeat at different scales. Picture a shallow basin at the edge of a bright, wind-washed coast. A thin sheet of seawater spreads across pale ground, warming under open sky. As the water thins, the surface begins to dull and then brighten again as crystals quietly take form. Each grain marks the end of a long journey through ocean currents and evaporation, a journey that continues again when the next tide arrives. Settle in to the Sleepy Mind channel, and tonight we journey into the quiet presence of salt. Long before it reaches a kitchen, a shoreline, or the surface of a road, this simple mineral has already moved through oceans, passed through the air as fine grains, and settled into the pores of rock and soil. It is easy to overlook because it is small and familiar, yet it shapes how water moves across the earth and through living bodies. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you enjoyed learning about salt